Reid traced the rim of his lukewarm coffee mug, the fluorescent hum of the office a dull ache behind his eyes. Another Tuesday, another spreadsheet. The numbers blurred, a monotonous procession of data entry and minor adjustments. He was good at it, precise and methodical, but the work offered little beyond a meager paycheck and the quiet certainty of sameness. He often felt like a cog, perfectly machined, spinning endlessly in a vast, indifferent mechanism. Yet, a stubborn current of determination ran through him, a quiet refusal to simply exist. He craved something more, something that felt real, even if he couldn't name it. The email landed in his inbox, a bland subject line, estate of, relative's name redacted. Reid squinted. He barely knew the man, a distant relative, an elder from his mother's side he'd met once, perhaps twice, at awkward family gatherings years ago. The body of the email was brief, formal, conveying condolences for the sudden passing and informing him he was the sole beneficiary of the estate. A cabin, it read, deep within the Blackwood Forest. An isolated patch of wilderness he'd only ever heard whispered about in hushed tones, mostly by his grandmother, who spoke of it with a peculiar mix of reverence and fear. A prickle of unease, sharp and unexpected, pierced through the dullness of his day. He reread the email. Sudden, mysterious death. The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. Why him? Why a cabin in a place so remote it felt mythical? He closed his eyes, picturing the man he vaguely remembered, a gaunt figure, eyes that seemed to hold ancient sorrows, a faint scent of wood smoke and something else. Something metallic, like old iron. Reid dismissed the thought. It was just an inheritance, a strange, unexpected twist in his predictable life. A chance, perhaps, to shake off the inertia. The decision was swift, fueled by that quiet determination. He submitted his resignation, packed a single duffel bag, and set out. The city lights receded in his rearview mirror, replaced by the encroaching shadows of the highway. Days blurred into a monotonous rhythm of driving, cheap motel coffee, and the growing sense of leaving behind everything familiar. The landscape slowly began to morph, buildings giving way to sprawling fields, then dense, towering pines. He reached the region's designated border checkpoint late one afternoon. A single, weathered booth stood sentinel on the edge of the forgotten road, flanked by towering, ancient trees whose branches laced together, obscuring the sky. A uniformed officer, his face etched with the weariness of solitude, emerged from the booth. He scrutinized Reid's identification, his gaze lingering on the destination Reid had provided. Blackwood, the officer murmured, his voice raspy, been a long time since anyone went out there voluntarily. His eyes, the color of river stones, held a strange, knowing glint. Mind the road. The gate lifted with a groan of rusted metal, and Reid drove through, the sound of the engine suddenly loud in the deepening stillness. The paved road soon gave way to a gravel track, then little more than a pair of deeply rutted tire paths swallowed by encroaching weeds. The forest pressed in on all sides, a wall of gnarled trunks and tangled undergrowth. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, casting the path in a perpetual twilight. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, pine needles, and something else, a faint, musty odor, like forgotten things. The cabin. A rusted iron gate, half off its hinges, marked the entrance to a long-abandoned driveway. The path leading to the front door was completely reclaimed by moss and weeds, suggesting years, perhaps decades, since anyone had walked it. Reid killed the engine. He stepped out, the forest swallowing the sound of the car door closing. The cabin loomed, a silent sentinel, radiating an almost palpable sense of age and abandonment. He walked slowly towards it, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves, each step feeling strangely amplified. In the profound quiet, he reached the porch, a warped and rotting platform that sagged under his weight. He was here, isolated and alone, at the edge of something vast and unknown. The cabin felt less like a dwelling and more like a waiting presence. Reid drove through the border checkpoint, the rusted gate groaning shut behind him like a dying sigh. The officer's parting words about the cabin's long empty status, about strange occurrences, gnawed at the edges of his resolve. He pushed them down, focusing instead on the winding dirt track ahead, the encroaching forest, a tunnel of ancient, gnarled limbs. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a primal perfume that settled deep in his lungs. It took another hour of careful maneuvering before the trees parted, revealing the cabin. It wasn't the quaint, rustic image he'd held in his mind. This was a hulking, dark timber structure, its roofline sagging, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from under heavy brows of moss. A stone chimney, blackened with age, stood sentinel at one end. A single, skeletal oak tree, stripped bare by some forgotten lightning strike, clawed at the sky beside it. He cut the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the distant caw of a crow and the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Reid stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots, a sound that seemed shockingly loud in the vast quiet. The determination he'd felt earlier wavered, replaced by a prickle of unease. He was truly alone here, miles from any other soul. Unlocking the heavy oak door was a struggle, the key turning with a grinding protest. Inside, the air was cold and stagnant, thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and something else, something faintly metallic, like old blood or forgotten iron. Sunlight struggled through grime-coated panes, casting watery stripes across the wide plank floors. He spent the first few hours methodically opening every window, letting the crisp autumn air scour the musty interior. As dusk began to paint the sky in bruised purples and oranges, Reid started unpacking. He hauled boxes of supplies and personal effects inside, his movements echoing through the empty rooms. He was in the kitchen, arranging canned goods in a cobwebbed pantry, when he heard it, a soft, distinct thud from the floor above. He froze, a can of beans suspended in his hand. Just the house settling, he muttered to himself, his voice sounding thin in the sudden quiet. He continued, but a moment later, a faint scratching began, rhythmic and persistent, from what sounded like the wall beside the ancient wood-burning stove. He rapped his knuckles against the timber. The scratching stopped instantly. He waited, his breath held. Nothing. Mice, he decided. Old houses had mice. He made a simple meal, the clatter of his fork against the plate unnervingly loud. He was about to turn in when he noticed it. He hadn't touched it since. Reid stared at it, a frown creasing his brow. Had he bumped it without realizing? No, he was sure he'd set it squarely. He picked it up, the wood cool and smooth under his fingers, and placed it back on the mantel, this time closer to the wall. He stood there for a long moment, listening. Sleep, when it came, was fitful. The oil lamp on his bedside table had gone out. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against cold glass. He was certain he'd filled it adequately. A low creak sounded from the hallway. He told himself the lamp had simply run out of fuel. The next morning, determined to shake off the lingering unease, Reid set about exploring the cabin more thoroughly. He started in the attic, a cramped, dusty space accessible by a pull-down ladder. Cobwebs clung like gray shrouds, and the air was thick with the smell of forgotten things. He uncovered trunks filled with moth-eaten clothes, rusted tools, and a collection of brittle, leather-bound books. Tucked away beneath a pile of faded tapestries, in a small, unmarked wooden chest, he found it. The leather was surprisingly supple, almost warm to the touch. He opened it, the pages yellowed and fragile, filled with elegant, looping script. The ink was faded in places, but legible. The entries were dated, spanning generations, beginning over 2 centuries ago. The language was archaic, hinting at rituals and pacts, at a dead ode. Reid's gaze fell upon a particular passage, his breath catching in his throat. It spoke of a guardian and a sacrifice, of ancient earth waking and payment in blood. He read the name of a distant relative, a name he barely recognized, followed by a date. A date that corresponded precisely with the sudden, inexplicable death that had led him here. The journal slipped from his trembling fingers, landing with a soft thud on the dusty floorboards. The rusted gate of the border checkpoint groaned shut behind him, a sound that scraped against the quiet of the forest Reid now plunged into. He pushed them down, focusing instead on the winding dirt track ahead, a ribbon of pale earth swallowed by an encroaching tide of ancient trees. The air grew cooler, heavier, thick with the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. Sunlight, once a cheerful companion, struggled to pierce the dense canopy, casting the path in a perpetual twilight. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, seemed amplified, turning the simple act of driving into a tense vigil. He found the cabin not long after, a hunched silhouette against the bruised sky. It was smaller than he'd imagined, built of dark, rough-hewn timber, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from under a heavy brow of moss-laden eaves. A tremor, not of cold, but of something deeper, snaked up his spine as he killed the engine. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood mixed with forgotten spices. He tried to dismiss it, blaming the enclosed space, the years of disuse. He spent the first few hours methodically opening windows, letting in what little light and air dared to penetrate the forest's gloom. He swept away cobwebs, cleared away the detritus of time. He'd walk through a doorway, and a sudden, sharp drop in temperature would prickle his skin, only to vanish the moment he turned to investigate. The first undeniable event occurred that evening. He was in the small kitchen, wiping down a grimy counter, when a faint scratching sound began, insistent and rhythmic, from the floorboards directly beneath his feet. He froze, his hand still holding the damp cloth. It wasn't the sound of mice, this was too deliberate, too steady, like claws dragging across wood, slowly, repeatedly. He rationalized it as the settling of an old house, the wind playing tricks. But the image of unseen claws persisted, etching itself into his thoughts. Over the next few days, the phenomena escalated, becoming more frequent and undeniable. A book, left open on the dusty table, would be found closed, or worse, open to a different, unsettling page. He'd stand still, straining to catch a coherent word, but they would always dissolve into a sibilant sigh, leaving him with a knot of unease in his gut. One morning, he woke to find a small, crudely carved wooden figurine, something resembling a twisted, limbless effigy, sitting on his bedside table. He had never seen it before. It wasn't a family heirloom he recognized, nor did it look like something his distant relative would have owned. Its eyes, two tiny, charred holes seemed to stare directly at him, imbued with a malevolent sentience. This was no longer just the quirks of an old house. This was targeted. This was a presence. He could no longer rationalize. He was not alone. The cabin held something ancient, something hungry. His determination to simply renovate and sell evaporated, replaced by a desperate need for answers. He had to understand what he had inherited, what had truly claimed his distant relative. Using his laptop, he managed to coax a weak signal from the edge of the property. He began to research, starting with the cabin's construction date, then delving into the local history of the forgotten forest. He found scant information at first, just fragmented mentions of the area being sparsely settled, known for its dense woods and isolated communities. But then, a cached article from a defunct local historical society website surfaced, riddled with archaic language. It spoke of rituals conducted to appease the ancient currents beneath the soil, to maintain the pact that ensured the land's fertility and the community's safety. The language grew increasingly cryptic, referencing a blood price and the turning of the harvest. It mentioned a specific family line, the keepers of the threshold, whose duty it was to live on the land and perform these rites. Reid's breath caught in his throat. His distant relative, the one who had died so suddenly and mysteriously, had been the last known occupant. And the family name listed in the historical record was his own. He scrolled further, his fingers trembling. The reveal hit him like a physical blow. He was a keeper. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the floorboards above him, followed by a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the cabin. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was a sound of deep, ancient hunger, now fully aware of its new host. He was trapped, and the pact, whatever it was, had just called in its due.